Chapter 6. Reddy Fox learns the secret. Nothing that you ever do, nothing good or nothing bad, but has effect on other folks, gives them pain or makes them glad. Peter Rabbit. Of course, Jenny Wren didn't mean to tell the secret of the old briar patch, because she had promised Peter Rabbit that she wouldn't. But she didn't see any harm in telling everyone she met that there was a secret there, at least that there was great news there. And so, because Jenny Wren is a great gossip, it wasn't long before all the little people on the green meadows and in the green forest and around the Smiling Pool had heard it and were wondering what the news could be. After Jimmy Skunk's visit came a whole string of visitors to the old briar patch. One would hardly have left before another would appear. Each one tried to act as if he had just happened around that way and didn't want to pass Peter's home without making a call. But each one asked so many questions that Peter knew what had really brought him. There was the desire to find out what the news in the old briar patch could be. But Peter was too smart for them, and they all went away no wiser than they came. That is, all but one. And that one was Reddy Fox. There isn't much going on in the green forest or on the green meadows that Reddy doesn't know about. He is sly, is Reddy Fox, and his eyes are sharp and his ears are keen. So little happens that he doesn't see or hear about. Of course, he heard the foolish gossip of Jenny Wren, and he pricked up his ears. So there's news down in the old briar patch, is there? A secret that Jenny Wren won't tell? I think I'll trot down there and make Peter a call. Of course, he'll be glad to see me. Reddy grinned wickedly as he said this to himself, for he knew that there was no one for whom Peter Rabbit had less love, unless it was old Granny Fox. So Reddy trotted down to the old briar patch. Peter saw him coming and scowled, for he guessed right away what Reddy was coming for, and he made ready to answer all Reddy's questions and still tell him nothing, as he had with all the others who had called. But Reddy asked no questions. He didn't once mention the fact that he had heard there was news in the old briar patch. He didn't once speak of Jenny Wren. He just talked about the weather and the old pasture, where Peter had made such a long visit, and all the time was as pleasant and polite as if he and Peter were the dearest of friends. But while he was talking, Reddy was using those sharp eyes and those keen ears of his the best he knew how. But the old briar patch was very thick, and he could see only a little way into it, and out of it came no sound to hint of a secret there. Then Reddy began to walk around the old briar patch in quite the most matter-of-fact way. But as he walked, that wonderful nose of his was testing every little breath of air that came out of the old briar patch. At last he reached a certain place where a little stronger breath of air tickled his nose. He stopped for a few minutes, and slowly a smile grew and grew. Then, without saying a word, he turned and trotted back towards the green forest. Peter Rabbit watched him go. Then he joined Mrs. Peter in the heart of the old briar patch. "My dear," he said with a sigh that was almost a sob, "Reddy Fox has found out our secret." "Never mind," said little Mrs. Peter brightly. "It would have to be found out soon anyway." Trotting back up the lone little path, Reddy Fox was grinning broadly. "It is news," said he. "Jenny Wren was right. It is news. But I don't believe anybody else knows it yet, and I hope they won't find it out right away, least of all Old Man Coyote. What a wonderful thing a good nose is. It tells me what my eyes cannot see nor my ears hear." Chapter 91. Blacky the Crow has sharp eyes. Mischief always waits to greet idle hands and idle feet. Peter Rabbit. That is what a lot of people say about Blacky the Crow. Of course, it is true that Blacky does get into a lot of mischief, but if people really knew him, they would find that he isn't as black as he looks. In fact, Blacky the Crow does a whole lot of good in his own peculiar way, but people are always looking for him to do bad things, and you know you most always see what you expect to see. Thus, the good Blacky does isn't seen, while the bad is, and so he has grown to have a reputation blacker than the coat he wears. But this doesn't worry Blacky the Crow. No, sir, it doesn't worry him a bit. You see, he has grown used to it. And then he is so smart that he is never afraid of being caught when he does do wrong things. No one has sharper eyes than Blacky, and no one knows better how to use them. There is very little going on in the green forest or on the green meadows that he misses when he is about. The day after Reddy Fox visited the old briar patch, and with his wonderful nose found out Peter Rabbit's secret, Blackie just happened to fly over the old briar patch on his way to Farmer Brown's cornfield. Now, being over the old briar patch, he could look right down into it and see all through it. Just as he reached it, he remembered having heard Sammy Jay say something about gossipy little Jenny Wrens having said that there was great news there. He hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now that he was right there, he might as well have a look for himself and see if there was any truth in it. So Blacky the Crow flew a little lower, and his sharp eyes looked this way and that way through all the bramble bushes of the old briar patch. He saw Peter Rabbit right away and winked at him. He thought Peter looked worried and anxious. Peter must have something on his mind, thought Blacky. I wonder where Mrs. Peter is. Just then he caught sight of her under the thickest growing sweetbriar bush. He had opened his mouth to shout, "Hello, Mrs. Peter," when he saw something that surprised him so that he didn't speak at all. He almost forgot to flap his wings to keep himself in the air. He hovered right where he was for a few minutes, looking down through the brambles. Then, with a hoarse chuckle, he started for the Smiling Pool, forgetting all about Farmer Brown's cornfield. "Caw, caw, caw!" he shrieked. "Peter Rabbit's got a family! Peter Rabbit's got a family!" Reddy Fox heard him and ground his teeth. Now Old Man Coyote will know and will try to catch those young rabbits when they ought to be mine because I found out about them first, he grumbled. Jimmy Skunk heard Blacky and grinned broadly. "So that's the great news Jenny Wren found out," said he. "I hope Peter will take better care of his babies than he ever has of himself. I must call at once." Redtail the Hawk heard, and he smiled too, but it wasn't a kindly smile like Jimmy Skunk's. "I think young Rabbit will taste very good for a change," said he. Chapter 12. Peter Rabbit's Nursery. With home, the home you call your own, it really doesn't matter where. There is no place in all the world that ever will or can compare Peter Rabbit. The news was out at last, thanks to Blacky the Crow. Peter Rabbit had a family. Yes, sir, Peter Rabbit had a family. Right away, the old briar patch became the most interesting place on the Green Meadows to all the little people who lived there and in the nearby Green Forest. Of course, all of Peter's friends called as soon as ever they could. They found Peter looking very proud and very important and very happy. Mrs. Peter looked just as proud and just as happy, but she also looked very anxious. You see, while she was very glad to have so many friends call, there were also other visitors. That is, they were not exactly callers, but they hung around the outside of the old briar patch, and they seemed quite as much interested as the friends who really called. Indeed, they seemed more interested. Who were they? Why, Reddy Fox was one. Then there was Old Man Coyote, also Redtail the Hawk, and Digger the Badger, and just at dusk, Hooty the Owl. They all seemed very much interested indeed, but every time little Mrs. Peter saw them, she shivered. You see, she couldn't help thinking that there was a dreadful, hungry look in their eyes, and if the truth is to be told, there probably was. But happy-go-lucky Peter Rabbit didn't let this worry him. Hadn't he grown up from a teeny-weeny baby and been smart enough to escape all these dangers which worried Mrs. Peter so? And if he could do it, of course his own babies could do it, with him to teach them and show them how. Besides, they were too little to go outside of the old briar patch now. Indeed, they were too little to go outside their nursery, which was in a clump of sweet briar bushes in the very middle of the old briar patch, and Peter felt that there they were perfectly safe. "It isn't time to worry yet," said Peter to little Mrs. Peter, as he saw the fright in her eyes as the shadow of Redtail passed over them. "I don't believe in borrowing trouble. Time enough to worry when there is something to worry about, and that won't be until these little scalawags of ours are big enough to run around and get into mischief. Did you ever see such beautiful babies in all your life?" For a minute, the worried look left little Mrs. Peter, and she gazed at the 4 little helpless babies fondly. "No," she replied softly, "I never did. Oh, Peter, they are perfectly lovely. This one is the perfect image of you, and I'm going to call him Little Pete. And don't you think his brother looks like his grandfather? I think we'll call him Little Jed." Peter coughed behind his hand as if something had stuck in his throat. He had no love for Little Jed's grandfather, Old Jed Thumper, the big, gray old rabbit who had tried so hard to drive him from the old pasture, but he didn't say anything. If Mrs. Peter wanted to name this one little Jed, he wouldn't say a word. Aloud, he said, "I think, my dear, that this one looks just as you must have looked when you were little, and so we'll call her Fuzzy. And her sister we'll call Wuzzy," continued Peter. "Was ever there such a splendid nursery for baby rabbits?" "I don't believe there ever was, Peter. It's better than my old nursery in the old pasture," replied little Mrs. Peter. As with a sigh of perfect happiness, she stretched out beside their 4 babies, and Peter softly tiptoed away to the nearest sweet clover patch, with his heart almost bursting with pride. Of the doings of Peter and Mrs. Peter Rabbit and their 4 children, there are many more stories, so many that one book will not hold all of them. Besides, Bowser the Hound insists that I must write a book about him, and I have promised to do it right away. So the next book will be Bowser the Hound.